Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you wherever you happen to be. I hope you're having a great day. Today we're going to be talking about imperialism. And imperialism is a process, oftentimes it's a process, whereby one nation, typically a stronger nation, will use its economic, military, social, and oftentimes cultural influences to take over, subjugate, or exert their influence into that of another nation. This concept of imperialism, at least the term itself, is applied to the United States at the latter part of the 19th century and as it turns into the 20th century. But the concept of the United States expanding across the globe to bring its institutions, that is, its religion, its government, its education, its technology, that process isn't brand new to the United States. And I'll explain that here in just a second, what I mean for that. There is a historical context for America, for the United States more specifically, to grow into a somewhat global empire. Really, when we think about the word imperialism, empire generally comes to mind. But imperialism is not something that is new on the world stage. Nations had been imperializing other nations for many, many years. And this time period that you see the United States engaging in imperialism, there's other European powers also doing that. To sort of highlight that, I want to read to you from a book called Give Me Liberty, written by Eric Foner. And he says, throughout the 19th century, large empires dominated much of the globe. After 1870, a new imperialism arose, dominated by European, Japan, Belgium, Great Britain, and France, where these powers consolidated their hold on colonies in Africa, and newly unified Germany acquired colonies there as well. The British and Russians sought to increase their influence in Central Asia, particularly to dominate parts of China. And so when the United States embarks upon this age of imperialism, they are not the only folks doing that. And there are a number of reasons for why nations might imperialize. Perhaps one of the most significant reasons, and this is true not only for the United States, but for other nations as well, but there is an industrializing world that is developing, and folks need not only raw materials to fuel that industrialization, but they need new markets to sell their goods to. And having colonies, having territories that you control, gives you access to raw materials that you may not have abundance of in your home country. And it also gives you now an area with which to sell your goods. And so that's one particular reason why certain areas are being carved up and taken over by these stronger powers. Eric Foner goes on to state, the justification for this expansion of imperial power was that it would bring modern civilization to the supposedly backward peoples of the non-European world. This was also a justification for the United States. In fact, William McKinley, who will be president of the United States, he will eventually be assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt will take over after. But when the United States went to war against the Philippines, and we had a protracted war in the Philippines that stretched from the 19th into the 20th century, it's called the Philippine-American War. To justify going to war against the Philippines, so that the United States could acquire that territory, William McKinley said, and I quote, I am quoting him, he said, we needed to go and help our, quote, little brown brothers to participate in government because they themselves cannot engage in self-government, okay? That's deeply flawed thinking. It's deeply racist and prejudicial thinking. But what it demonstrates is that the United States thought it could bring modern civilization to people who could not bring that civilization to themselves. So there's definitely an idea of American superiority. There's definitely an idea of we need raw materials, we need new markets, and those ideas permeate other nations as well. Eric Foner goes on to state, The natives, according to their colonial occupiers, would be instructed in Western values. They would learn the Christian religion, and that's another motivating factor, Christianity, right? We need to bring that institution to other parts of the world where it is not. It says eventually they, that is the imperialized folks, would be accorded the right of self-government, okay? The reality is that oftentimes self-government didn't happen. Now, for the United States, they enact their imperialism in a number of different regions of the world. Asia, which we've already made note of, obviously in the Philippines, Guam, they're also going to implement themselves in Guam or have an influence in Guam, and China as well. In China, there isn't so much a military coup or a militaristic endeavor. Instead, what we do is we engage in a diplomacy known as the open door policy, which basically stipulated that China would open up its doors to the whole world for open and free trade. Now, this was a very different process than the Chinese had initially been doing, but once imperialism really got underway, European and other Western powers really took control over China's trade ability and forced them to open trade with anybody. You're going to see the United States put its influence in Latin America. You're going to see us in Panama, for example, where we will build the Panama Canal, or at least complete the Panama Canal. You also see us in the Caribbean, the Spanish-American War, where we are going to Cuba Libre, free Cuba from the colonial reigns of Spain. So we're a little bit all over the place, and in the end, the United States takes possession of Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. We have open trade in China. You are going to see that we will purchase Alaska. We will, in many ways, establish a military coup in Hawaii and take possession of Hawaii. Eventually, it becomes a state in the 1950s. And we will have deep economic ties in Latin America, and for better or for worse. And so the United States really expands its influence across the globe. And even to this day, the United States still has access to islands, you know, off in the middle of nowhere where they've established military bases. So it's not to say that imperialism is completely dead and gone, although for the United States and many other Western nations, they're no longer actively imperializing. But like colonialism, imperialism is a process that once it gets going, it's very difficult to stop, and it's very difficult and perhaps even impossible to roll the tide of that imperialism back. Now, this is not the first time that the United States has ever really embarked upon empire building. And we don't like to use the word empire building because we don't like to think of the United States as being an empire. Because, you know, when you think of empire, you think of Rome, you think of Britain, you think of abuses, and it's generally a negative picture that comes to mind. But really, the United States did become an empire. You got to think when it started off as 13 small colonies, and then it grew into a country of over 50 states, 2 of which aren't even on the continent, and it has influence across the globe. We also still have, control over Puerto Rico. So I think it's fair to say that empire is a good word. The word or phrase that we gave it before we said imperialism was a word known as manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is this idea that the United States had a providential destiny. It was a destiny given by God to overspread the entire North American hemisphere. That is, to stretch from sea to shining sea. Now, of course, the United States does eventually go from sea to shining sea, but just because the map turned blue, that is, we hit the Pacific Ocean, didn't mean our ambitions stopped. Eric Foner once again goes on to state, territorial expansion, of course, had been a feature of American life from well before independence. But the 1890s marked a major turning point in America's relationship with the rest of the world. Americans were increasingly aware of themselves as an emerging world power. Quote, "We are a great imperial republic destined to exercise a controlling influence upon the actions of mankind and to affect the future of the world," proclaimed Henry Watterson, who was a newspaper editor. And so this idea that the United States needs to overspread, needs to imperialize, it's very much rooted in a number of causes, some of which I've already made mention to you. I'm just looking at my notes here just so I can make sure I've got everything right. There are a number of reasons why you might want to imperialize. One I've already made mention of: new markets and raw materials for industrialization. Two, the idea of American superiority. In fact, there's this idea known as American exceptionalism. And at the root of that, as far as I'm concerned, you might disagree, but at the root of this concept of American exceptionalism is the idea not only that the United States is different from other countries, but that it's better than other countries. And if you can convince yourself that the United States is better than these other nations, then you can justify imperializing other countries with the premise that you're bringing them a better civilization than what they have. You also have religious impulses, right? The idea to missionize, Christianize. The other idea that some folks pitched around, particularly a man by the name of Alfred T. Mahan, Alfred Thayer Mahan, he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And basically his argument was this: if you want to be a great nation, you need to have a strong navy, you need to have strong world trade, you need to have a merchant fleet, and all of these things ultimately support imperialism. And so in many ways, Alfred T. Mahan's idea that if the United States wants to be a significant player on the world stage, then they need to grow and expand their merchant fleet. They need to have world trade across various countries. Then you'll be like every other great empire that has ever existed. And so these types of thoughts, this way of thinking, contributes to the United States getting involved in things like the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was a very short-lived war. It was about 4 months, I believe. Secretary of State stated that it was a splendid little war. More people died of disease, malaria, than they did of actual combat wounds. But basically the idea behind the Spanish-American War was that the United States was going to help free Cuba from Spanish colonialism. And yet, interestingly, in the process of us freeing Cuba, we took possession of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. In fact, some of the very first naval engagements took place in Manila and Manila Bay in the Philippines, which is interesting because if we're going to fight the Spanish to free Cuba, then why are we having actions in the Philippines? There will also be actions taken in Hawaii, as I already mentioned, where basically we do what we can do to toss out Queen Liliuokalani. And I don't think I've said that correctly, but there you go. Like John Green of Crash Course History, butchering things is what I do as far as naming things goes. But a coup will effectively be put in place there because of interests that the United States has in the sugar production in Hawaii. And, you know, as we go through the rest of the material this week, I'm going to give you other examples of where the United States participated in this sort of expansion and imperialism and what those events mean. But in the end, the United States grows, it expands. And for better or for worse, this period of history really helps to make the United States what it is today. And there were both positive and negative consequences. I think the negative consequences are probably more apparent. But the United States became somewhat of an economic powerhouse because of its ability to expand its trade and its world market. So, you know, in that particular sense, it's a good thing. But at the same time, we have to caveat that and be objective and recognize that a lot of people were steamrolled. A lot of racist and prejudicial ideas were used to justify some of these actions. And so, you know, there's always the positive and the negatives going on there. So there's obviously reading going on this week that I'll have you do some videos. So just, you know, dive into this content, see what you think. You know, I'll be interested to see what your opinions are, you know, and perhaps you could even make some kind of comment about whether or not you think we are still dealing with imperialism to this very day. Not perhaps, you know, continuing on in imperializing, but more so what the ripple effects have been on American society. So if you have questions or concerns, contact me. I'll get back to you. But as always, Go in peace. Be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.